The morning Rose Hart rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882. The dust rose around her horse's hooves like a curtain parting on a stage, and every man on the main street stopped what he was doing to watch a woman who clearly had no intention of being ignored. She was not the kind of woman men expected to see riding alone through cattle country. She sat her horse with the posture of someone who had learned early that the world required a woman to prove herself twice over before it extended even half the courtesy it gave a man freely. Her dark green riding jacket was tailored and pressed despite the long journey from Wichita, and her auburn hair was pinned beneath a hat that managed to look both practical and elegant. The leather satchel strapped across her saddle was thick with documents, contracts, and surveying maps, because Rose Hart had not ridden 3 days across open Kansas to admire the scenery. She had come on behalf of the Meridian Land and Railroad Company to purchase a specific 4,700-acre tract of land that sat directly in the path of a proposed rail line. The land belonged to one Clayton Bristol, and according to her employer, Mr. Gerald Dunmore, Clayton Bristol was the last and most stubborn obstacle between the railroad and a fortune. Rose had been told very little about the man himself. Dunmore had described him dismissively as a dirt farmer clinging to inherited acreage, the kind of proud fool who thought sentiment was a sound business strategy. He had sent 2 other men before her, both of whom had returned to Wichita with nothing but bruised egos and politely worded refusals. Dunmore had then decided, with the logic particular to men who underestimate women, that a woman might soften the situation. He had said, without a trace of irony, that perhaps a gentler approach was needed. Rose had accepted the assignment not because she appreciated being used as a softening instrument, but because she was the best negotiator in the company and she knew it, and she intended to prove that on her own terms. She found the livery stable at the far end of Caldwell's Main Street and left her horse in the care of a boy of about 12 who told her, unprompted, that the Bristol Ranch was 4 miles south of town and that Mr. Bristol came in for supplies every Thursday, which happened to be today. She thanked the boy, paid him a fair coin for the information, and went to find herself a room at the Cattlemen's Hotel, which was a 2-story wooden building that smelled of tobacco and pine resin, and the particular kind of optimism that characterized frontier towns in the early 1880s. The hotel proprietor, a round-faced woman named Mrs. Aldine, told her that the Bristol Ranch was well known in the area. That Clayton Bristol was 31 years old, unmarried, and had been working that land since his father passed 4 years prior. That he had turned down 3 separate offers from 2 separate railroad companies without much discussion. That the locals respected him for it, because many of them quietly feared what the railroad would do to the character of the region even as they acknowledged the commerce it would bring. Rose listened carefully, thanked Mrs. Aldine, and went upstairs to review her documents. She spread the survey maps across the narrow bed and studied the land she had come to buy. The Bristol tract was extraordinary, she had to admit. The survey notes described rich bottomland along a creek called Sycamore Run, gently rolling hills that would have been the envy of any farmer east of the Missouri, and a position that placed it at the natural geographical heart of a future cattle shipping corridor. She understood, looking at those maps, why a man might not want to sell. She also understood, looking at the numbers her company had authorized her to offer, that it was a great deal of money, more than most men in Kansas would see in a decade of hard work. She had her plan in order. She would be straightforward, professional, and generous with the figures. She would appeal to reason rather than sentiment, because sentiment was not a thing you could put a price on, but reason could always be met at some agreed-upon point. She had done this before, in land offices and courthouse rooms and parlors, and she was good at it. She was, in every measurable professional sense, prepared. What she was not prepared for was Clayton Bristol himself. She saw him first through the window of the hotel dining room, where she had gone for a late breakfast. He was crossing the main street with the easy, unhurried stride of a man entirely at home in the world he occupied, leading a dark bay horse by the reins with one hand and carrying a list of some kind in the other. He was tall, broad-shouldered in the way that comes from years of actual physical labor rather than any studied effort, and he was reading his list with a small frown of concentration that made him look unexpectedly thoughtful for a man in dusty work clothes and a battered hat. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, a jaw that looked like it had been carved with some intention, and eyes, she discovered when he glanced up at a passing wagon, that were a clear and startling gray even from this distance. She noticed all of this the way a person notices a sudden change in weather, involuntarily and with some irritation at herself for noticing at all, and then she returned to her coffee and her mental preparation for the meeting she intended to engineer before the morning was done. She found her opportunity when Clayton Bristol entered the general store on the north side of the street. She gave him a few minutes, then followed. The store was dim and fragrant with coffee and leather goods and the sharp smell of new rope. Clayton was at the counter speaking with the proprietor about a shipment of fence wire, and Rose took a moment to gather herself before she walked directly toward him with her hand already extended. "Mr. Bristow," she said, "my name is Rose Hart. I represent the Meridian Land and Railroad Company out of Wichita. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time." He turned to look at her with an expression that was not unfriendly, but was entirely calm, the expression of a man who had been expecting something like this, and had already decided how he felt about it. His eyes were even grayer up close, the color of a sky before snow, and they were direct in a way that made her want to be more honest than she had planned. "Miss Hart," he said, and his voice was low and even, "I have a feeling I know why you are here. I will tell you what I told the other gentleman your company sent. I am not interested in selling." "I heard that," she said pleasantly, not withdrawing her hand until he shook it, which he did with the slight hesitation of a man who had not expected a woman negotiator and was reassessing rapidly. "I also think that you have not yet heard the full scope of what Meridian is prepared to offer. I am not asking you to decide this morning. I am asking for an honest conversation." He studied her for a moment. The store proprietor behind the counter was watching them both with poorly concealed interest. "I am buying fence wire," Clayton said finally. "I can wait," Rose replied. Something shifted very slightly in his expression, a fractional softening around the eyes that was not quite a smile but was close to one. He turned back to the counter and completed his transaction, and Rose waited by the door with her satchel on her shoulder and what she hoped was a composed expression. And when he had collected his receipt and picked up his hat from the hook by the door, he stopped beside her and said, "There is a bench outside. I have a few minutes before I need to load up." They sat on the bench in the mild spring sunshine, and Rose laid out the offer methodically and professionally. She told him the figure, which was substantially higher than the previous offers. She explained the terms of the purchase agreement, the timeline, the provisions for transition. She spoke clearly and without condescension, and she watched his face the whole time, reading him the way she had learned to read every person across a negotiating table. What she read surprised her. He was not angry, he was not dismissive. He listened with the complete and focused attention of someone who took the conversation seriously, and when she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the street. "I know what the land is worth," he said finally. "I also know what it is worth to me, and those are not the same number." "They rarely are," Rose said, "but the first number can become substantial enough that the second one stops being the determining factor. Maybe for some men." He turned to look at her then, directly and without apology. "My grandfather came to this land with nothing and built it from nothing. My father built more. I am not interested in converting 30 years of that into paper money and moving somewhere else." "Where would you go?" she asked, and then caught herself because that was not a negotiator's question. That was a personal question, and she was not here to be personal, but he answered it. "Nowhere I would choose," he said simply. "That is the point." She looked at him for a moment and found, to her considerable annoyance, that she understood exactly what he meant. "I am going to ask something of you," she said, returning to professionalism. "I am here through the end of the week. I would like the opportunity to make a full presentation of the proposed development, including the benefits to the surrounding county. Would you be willing to hear that out before you make a final decision?" He turned her request over visibly, not stalling but genuinely thinking. "You can come out to the ranch tomorrow afternoon," he said. "I will hear you out. But I want you to understand that I have heard everything before, Miss Hart, and my answer has not changed." "I understand," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Bristol." He stood, set his hat on his head, and looked down at her with that same gray directness. "Do you know how to ride?" "I got here from Wichita on horseback," she said. The almost smile came back. "South of town, past the cottonwood grove, and left at the fork. Noon." Then he walked to his wagon, loaded his fence wire with the efficiency of a man who did not waste motion, climbed up, and drove away. Rose watched him go and told herself firmly that she was simply observing a man she needed to persuade, and that the observation was purely professional in nature. She did not entirely convince herself. The Bristol ranch was not what she had expected, although she would have been hard-pressed to say exactly what she had expected. She had envisioned something more austere, perhaps, the homestead of a man who was stubborn and proud and resistant to progress. What she found instead, at the end of a winding track through grassland, and past a stand of sycamore trees bright with new spring leaves, was a place of quiet and unmistakable beauty. The main house was built from limestone, the kind of pale golden stone that Kansas threw up in abundance, and that caught the afternoon light in a way that made it glow. It had a wide covered porch and 3 large windows on the south-facing wall, and someone, at some point, had planted rose bushes along the front fence that were just now beginning to leaf out in bright and determined green. The barns were solid and well-maintained. The fences were straight. There were horses in the south pasture, 3 of them, and a small kitchen garden laid out with meticulous care along the east side of the house. Sycamore Run itself was visible from the gate, a silver thread of water cutting through bottomland so rich and dark it looked almost black in the afternoon light. Clayton came out to the gate when he heard her horse, and he took the reins from her while she dismounted with an ease that was polite rather than presumptuous, the ease of a man who did these things without thinking about whether they were required. "You found it," he said. "Your directions were good," she said, and then stopped talking because she was looking at the house and the land and the creek and the rose bushes, and something was happening in her chest that was inconvenient and professional and not at all part of the plan, which was that she was beginning to understand this place. He showed her the ranch. She had not asked for the tour, but he gave it without it seeming like persuasion, simply walking her through what his family had built with the quiet pride of someone who wanted the thing to be understood on its own terms. He showed her the stone house his grandfather had quarried and laid himself over the course of 3 years. He showed her the barn his father had raised with the help of neighboring families in a weekend of collective labor that was still talked about in the county. He showed her the fields along Sycamore Run where the soil was so fertile that it grew everything they planted in it without much argument, and the creek itself, which ran clear and cold over smooth limestone, and was, he said, the reason the first Bristol had chosen this specific piece of ground over any other. He had 3 possible homestead claims, Clayton told her, crouching at the edge of the creek and running his hand through the water with the unconscious ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Most men chose for the most tillable acreage. He chose for the water. He said a man who has good water will always find a way to grow things, but a man who grows things without good water will eventually lose everything he grew. Rose stood beside him and looked at the creek and thought about her grandfather, who had been a farmer in Ohio before the bank took the land, and who had said something very similar once, in different words. "He was right," she said, and she meant it genuinely, not professionally. Clayton looked up at her from his crouch, and she saw something register in his expression, something that had not been there before, a small recalibration of his understanding of who she was. He stood. "You did not come here to agree with my grandfather." "No," she admitted, "but that does not mean he was wrong." They went back to the house and sat on the porch, and Rose spread her maps on the small table between their chairs and made her full presentation. She was thorough and honest, and she did not oversell, which was something she had learned early was the most reliable way to lose a negotiation. She laid out the railroad's plans, the projected benefits to the county in terms of cattle shipping and commerce, the compensation package, the timeline. She answered his questions directly, including the difficult ones, because he asked difficult questions with the precision of a man who had thought about this carefully and from multiple angles. He asked about the families who currently leased portions of the southeast corner of his property, 2 homesteading families who farmed there under informal arrangements. What would become of them? Rose paused, because this was the honest pause, the one where she had to tell him something she did not like telling. "The railroad's plans for that corner involve a depot and maintenance yard," she said. "The current residents would need to relocate." He was quiet for a moment. "Tom Garrett has been on that land for 6 years," he said. "He has 2 daughters and a wife and a crop rotation that is finally starting to produce well. And the Colton family has been there 3 years and has a new baby. You are asking me to be the instrument of their displacement. I am asking you to consider the broader economic." "I know what you are asking," he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was firm. "And I am telling you that the broader economic argument has never once in my experience accounted for the specific human cost it generates." Rose looked at him and thought, with a clarity that she had not anticipated, that she liked him very much. Not in the way of attraction, or not only in that way, but in the deeper way that comes from recognizing in someone else a set of values that you hold yourself and rarely find confirmed in the world. "You are not wrong," she said. He looked at her with some surprise. "The railroad will build the depot somewhere," she continued. "But if the specific location could be shifted half a mile east, the Garrett and Colton properties would be clear of it entirely. I do not have the authority to promise that change, but I believe I could make a case to my employer." "You would do that? If you would agree to continue the conversation beyond today, yes. It is worth attempting." He leaned back in his chair and studied her with those clear gray eyes for a long moment. The afternoon had softened around them, the light going warm and golden across the grassland, and somewhere in the cottonwood trees along the fence line, a bird was singing with an enthusiasm that seemed almost pointed. "I am not going to sell you this land, Miss Hart," he said, and his voice carried something different now, something that was not dismissal but was almost regret. "I have thought about it more carefully than you might assume, because I am not a fool and I understand what the railroad means for this region. But this land is not mine to sell in the way you mean. It belongs to the people who worked it before me and to whatever comes after me. I am just the person holding it right now." "Does that make sense to you?" "Yes," she said, and her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I did not expect you to say that," he said. "I did not expect to mean it," she replied honestly. They looked at each other in the golden afternoon light, and something passed between them that was not about land or railroads or money at all. Something simpler and older and considerably more complicated than anything either of them had expected to find on this particular afternoon. She left an hour later than she had intended. He walked her to her horse and held the reins while she mounted, and when she took them from his hand, their fingers brushed briefly against each other, which was nothing, which was the most ordinary thing in the world, which she thought about for the entire 4-mile ride back to Caldwell in a way that was entirely unprofessional and not at all useful. She sat down that evening in her hotel room and wrote a long letter to Gerald Dunmore, outlining her assessment of the negotiation. She wrote that Clayton Bristol was not going to sell, that no amount of money would change that, and that she believed his reasons were not obstinacy but principle, which was a different thing entirely, and one that Meridian should acknowledge. She suggested that the railroad corridor could be adjusted slightly to route around the Bristol land rather than through it, that the geographic alternative was workable according to the survey data, and that the additional construction cost would be offset by the goodwill of not being known as the company that forced a third-generation family off their land. She also noted, in the careful language of professional recommendation, that the Garrett and Colton lease families deserved consideration regardless of what the company decided. She sealed the letter, put it with her other documents, and then sat for a long time at the narrow window looking out at the dark street of Caldwell and thinking about rose bushes and limestone houses and gray eyes and a creek that ran clear over smooth stone. She told herself she would send the letter in the morning and return to Wichita with her recommendation, and the negotiation would be complete. She did not return to Wichita the next morning. She sent the letter, and she told herself she was staying an extra day to await Dunmore's response, which was not entirely untrue. But she also knew, in the honest part of herself that she had been very good at ignoring for most of her 27 years, that she was staying because she wanted to see Clayton Bristol again, and the professional justification was useful cover for something that was not professional at all. She encountered him the next morning at the edge of town, where Sycamore Run crossed under the main road on its way east. She had gone for a walk because the hotel room had felt small, and the morning was fine and clear, with the particular freshness of a Kansas spring morning that made you feel like the world had been recently washed. He was there checking the condition of the culvert beneath the road, because there had been heavy rain the week before, and several of the road crossings in the county had washed out, and he served, apparently, on some informal committee of local men who kept an eye on such things. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the wooden bridge, and the expression that crossed his face, quickly enough that he probably did not know it was visible, was one of pure and uncomplicated pleasure. As if seeing her was simply a good thing, and he had not yet organized himself to be careful about showing it. "Miss Hart," he said, climbing up from the culvert inspection with easy grace. "You are still here. I am waiting on a response from my employer," she said, which was true. "Of course," he said, and something in his tone suggested he understood there might be more to it than that, and was politely not saying so. They walked together along the creek bank without either of them quite deciding to do so, and within 2 minutes of easy conversation, Rose discovered that Clayton Bristol was also a reader, that he had a preference for history and natural science, that he had strong opinions about the management of the communal grazing lands east of town that were being overstocked by several of the larger ranchers, that he had once ridden as far as Denver on a cattle drive at the age of 19, and had found the mountains extraordinary, but had been glad to come back to the flat horizons of Kansas, because there was, in his opinion, something honest about being able to see as far as the land went without obstruction. He asked about Wichita, about her work, about how she had come to be a land negotiator for a railroad company, and he asked with the directness of genuine curiosity rather than politeness. She told him more than she usually told anyone. She told him about growing up in St. Louis with a mother who ran a millinery business and a father who had worked for a land survey company, and had taken her along on summer surveys when she was a girl, which was where she had learned to read a map the way other girls learned to read music. She told him about coming to Wichita at 22 to work as a clerk for Meridian, and working her way into negotiation through sheer persistence, and the demonstration, repeated until it could no longer be ignored, that she was better at it than the men who had been doing it before her. She told him that she found the work interesting in the abstract, but that she had started, in the past year or so, to feel the grinding weight of working for a company whose interests and her own were not always identical. He listened with the same complete attention, He had given her negotiation proposal, which was something she found she did not take for granted. "Why did you stay with them if you felt that way?" he asked. "Because I did not have an alternative yet," she said, "and because I am good at the work even when I am not sure the work is good." "That is honest," he said. "I have been more honest in the last 2 days than I have been in quite some time," she said, and then was embarrassed by her own admission and looked at the creek instead of at him. He did not use the moment against her, which she appreciated. He simply said, "The creek is at its best in spring," in a voice that gave her room to collect herself, and then pointed out a pair of herons standing motionless in the shallows 50 yards upstream, waiting with the concentrated patience of expert hunters. They walked back toward town when the morning had advanced and parted at the edge of the main street, and before he turned away he said, "There is a gathering at the Garrett place this Saturday evening. Neighbors come together, some music, supper. It is not much by town standards, but it is pleasant. If you are still here, you would be welcome." She told him she would consider it. She considered it for about 30 seconds after he had walked away, and then accepted in her own mind that she would be there. Dunmore's response arrived by telegraph on Friday, and it was not what she had hoped. He acknowledged her recommendation about the alternate route, noted that his engineers had reviewed it previously, and found it marginally more expensive than the current plan, and said that the added cost was not justifiable given the company's current financial position. He instructed her to make one final offer to Clayton Bristol, significantly above the previous figure, on a take-it-or-leave-it basis, and to return to Wichita by Monday whether or not the sale was concluded. Rose sat with the telegram in her hands for a long time. She thought about Clayton's words on the porch, about his grandfather choosing the land for its water, about the Garrett and Colton families in the southeast corner, about the rose bushes along the front fence. She thought about herself, about what she had told him on the creek bank, about working for a company whose interests and her own were no longer aligned. She spent Friday afternoon writing 2 documents. The first was a formal letter to Gerald Dunmore, stating that she would convey his final offer to Mr. Bristol as instructed. The second was her letter of resignation from the Meridian Land and Railroad Company, effective upon her return to Wichita. She sealed both, addressed them, and placed them with the outgoing mail at the hotel desk. Then she felt, for the first time in several years, that she could breathe without constraint. She rode out to the Bristol ranch on Saturday morning, not for the gathering in the evening, but because she wanted to deliver Dunmore's message in person and be straightforward about it, and also because she had made herself a promise that she was done hiding professional motives behind personal ones or personal ones behind professional ones. He was in the north field mending a stretch of fence when she arrived, working with the steady rhythm of a man who was comfortable with physical labor, and he looked up when he heard the horse and set down his wire pliers and came to the fence line to meet her. "You have an answer from your company," he said. "I do." She dismounted and handed him the reins, which she had begun to do automatically, and he took them with the same easy naturalness, and they stood together on either side of the fence in the morning sunshine. Their final offer is $140,000 for the full 4,700 acres, with transition assistance for any tenant families currently on the land. He was quiet. "I know," she said. "I also want to tell you something else because I think you deserve to hear it plainly. I am recommending that they accept the alternate route. I believe the surveyed alternative is viable. I wrote as much to my employer. He disagrees for financial reasons that are not without validity, but I do not believe the additional cost is so prohibitive that it could not be absorbed by a company of Meridian's size if there were genuine will to do so." She paused. "There is not genuine will to do so, and I want you to know that because you should make your decision knowing the full picture." He studied her for a moment. "You are telling me things your employer would not want you to tell me." "Yes." "Why?" She met his eyes directly and told the truth. "Because I have spent this week becoming convinced that you are right about this land and about what it represents, and I have no business standing here asking you to sell something I would not sell in your position." He looked at her for a long time. The morning was perfectly quiet except for the wind in the grass, and a meadowlark going off somewhere to the east with its waterfall song. "You are not like the other negotiators they sent," he said finally. "I am well aware," she said, and something in her tone must have carried more feeling than she intended because his expression changed very slightly, warming in a way that made her heart do something inconvenient and true. "I'm still not going to sell," he said. "I know. You came out here this morning to tell me that." "I came out here to be honest with you," she said, "which I realize is not a very effective negotiating strategy." He almost smiled. The almost smile was becoming a thing she catalogued privately, the small expressions that lived in the corner of his mouth and the corner of his eyes that did not quite reach a full expression but were entirely legible if you were paying attention, and she had been paying attention with an intensity she was beginning to stop pretending was professional. "You are staying for the gathering tonight," he said, and it was not quite a question. "If I am still welcome," she said. "You are more welcome now than when I invited you," he said simply. He handed her back her reins and went back to his fence mending, and she turned her horse toward town with the feeling of having done a difficult and right thing, which was a sensation she had missed more than she had realized. The gathering at the Garrett farm was everything he had said it was, and more. About 30 people came in the late afternoon, bringing food and a fiddle player named Webb who turned out to be the best natural musician she had heard in years. And there were long tables in the yard set with oil lamps as the evening came on, and the smell of a whole roasting pig, and children running between the adults' legs in the long blue dusk. Tom Garrett was a large, sun-weathered man with an enormous laugh, and his wife Martha was the kind of woman whose warmth was so immediate and total that you felt you had known her for years within minutes of meeting her. They welcomed Rose without question, the way people do who are genuinely secure in their own generosity. Clayton arrived late, after most people had settled, and came directly to where Rose was sitting with Martha Garrett and a couple of the other farm wives. He brought her a plate without asking and sat beside her on the bench without ceremony, and they talked through the meal with the ease of people who have passed some invisible threshold of acquaintance and arrived at something more comfortable. He danced when Webb struck up the first reel. She discovered this when Martha pulled her to her feet and into the set, and there was Clayton in the opposite row, moving through the figures with the natural ease of a man who had been doing this since he was a boy. And when the dance paired them for a turn, his hand found the small of her back as if it knew exactly where to go, and they were close enough that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his gray eyes. And the evening was warm, and the oil lamps were amber, and the fiddle was brilliant, and Rose Hart, who had ridden to Caldwell, Kansas, to conduct a business transaction, found herself completely and utterly lost in a moment she had not prepared for and did not want to exit. They danced twice more before the evening aged past dancing. They sat together when it slowed on the edge of the lamplight, and the conversation moved between them in the easy way that feels like rest rather than effort, which Rose had experienced so rarely in her life that it had an almost physical quality like warmth or stillness. At some point she said, "I am leaving Monday," and regretted it immediately because it broke something in the air between them. He was quiet for a moment. "Wichita." "Yes." "I have a resignation letter to deliver." He looked at her with surprise. "You resigned." "I wrote the letter yesterday. It felt like the honest thing to do." "What will you do?" "I have not entirely worked that out," she admitted. "I have savings. I have skills that other people value. I am not afraid of a period of uncertainty." He looked at her in the amber light with that direct gray gaze, and this time the almost smile went all the way, and it changed his face in a way that was wholly and quietly devastating. "You are remarkable," he said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of any qualification or elaborate construction, hit her somewhere behind her sternum with the clean force of something completely true. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I have been told I am formidable." That too, he said, but I meant remarkable. She looked at the lamp flame and thought about Monday, which was 2 days away, and felt the distance of it with an acuteness that told her everything she needed to know about what was happening in her heart and how serious it had already become. Sunday, she rode out without having been invited. She told herself she was returning the survey maps she had borrowed to show him, which was a real thing she was doing, but it was the thinnest possible professional justification for what was actually a visit. She was done with thin professional justifications. She rode out because she wanted to see him. He was chopping wood behind the house when she arrived, and he stopped when he saw her and came around to take her horse, and he was not surprised to see her, or if he was not performing any particular version of it. They spent the afternoon together in a way that had no formal structure and no agenda, which was a new thing for Rose, and one she discovered she liked with a depth that surprised her. He showed her the beehives he kept in the orchard at the north end of the property, and she did not flinch from the bees, which she could tell pleased him. He showed her the root cellar his grandfather had dug, which was still in use and beautifully cool on a warm afternoon. He showed her his father's journals, 3 volumes of dense, close-written notes on farming and weather and the life of the land, which she handled with the care they deserved. She showed him nothing, because she had nothing to show. But she told him about herself more fully than she had before, about the years of being the only woman in rooms full of men who expected her to either disappear or decorate, about the discipline of making herself indispensable until the men in question had no choice but to acknowledge what she could do. She told him about the loneliness of it, which she had not told anyone, the specific loneliness of competence without community. He listened with the same complete attention and without offering solutions or consolations that would have reduced what she had said. He simply acknowledged it, said that it sounded like a tremendous amount of invisible work to maintain, and asked if she had ever thought about what she would do if she were not required to maintain it. The question opened up something she had been keeping tightly shut for a long time. "I think about it more lately," she said quietly. "What does it look like?" he asked. She looked out at Sycamore Run, visible from where they sat on the back porch steps. "Somewhere with good water," she said, and then felt the weight of what she had just said. He felt it too. She could tell from the way he went still beside her, not with tension but with the careful stillness of something important arriving that you do not want to disturb. They sat in that stillness for a while, and the afternoon moved around them, and the creek ran. He said her name, Rose, just her name, and the way he said it was different from every previous time, and when she turned to look at him, the expression on his face was open and undisguised in a way that a man of his contained nature would only allow if he had made a deliberate decision to allow it. "I know you are leaving tomorrow," he said. "I know this week has been a business trip, and I know you did not come here for any reason that involves me. But I have to tell you something, and I will say it plainly because I do not know any other way to say things." He paused, gathering himself. "I have not felt what I feel when I am with you in a very long time, and I would rather say it and have you tell me it is too soon or too impractical than not say it and have you go back to Wichita without knowing." Rose felt her heart beating very clearly and deliberately inside her chest. "What do you feel?" she asked. "Like the world is more interesting," he said. "Like I want to know every single thing about you. Like there is a version of my life that has you in it and that version is better in every way I can imagine." He looked at her steadily. "I do not say that lightly." "No," she said softly. "I can tell you do not. I have nothing to offer that is fashionable," he continued. "I have land that I refuse to sell and 2 families on my property who depend on my decisions and about 40 miles of fence line and a creek. I am not a wealthy man. I am not a complicated man. But I am sincere, Rose. I am very sincere." She looked at him, this man who had refused to be purchased and refused to be dishonest, and refused to pretend that land was just land or that people were just resources, or that a woman who rode 3 days to buy his life was just an instrument of her employer's ambition. She looked at him and felt something in herself settle, the way a door settles into its frame when the house stops shifting, fitting exactly and completely. "I told you I have not worked out what comes next," she said. "Yes. I also told you I have skills that are useful and savings and no fear of uncertainty." "You did. Caldwell needs a land surveyor," she said, and she was almost smiling now. "I can read a survey map better than most men in this county." He looked at her with those gray eyes wide in something that was hope in its most direct and unguarded form. "Is that a practical consideration," he said, "or is it something else?" "It is both," she said. "It has always been both, since approximately the moment I saw you cross the main street with your fence wire list." He exhaled slowly, like a man who has been holding his breath for some time. Then he reached out and took her hand, not as a gesture of theater or declaration, but simply because they were sitting close enough that he could, and it was the most natural thing in the world, and her hand felt the warmth of his and did not withdraw. "Monday," he said, "is still Monday." "Yes," she said, "but you will be back." She looked at him. She looked at Sycamore Run. She looked at the rose bushes around the front of the house, visible around the corner of the porch. "Yes," she said, "I will be back." She rode to Wichita on Monday as planned, and she delivered her resignation to Gerald Dunmore in person, which gave her the satisfaction of watching the expression on his face when he understood that she was serious. He attempted to talk her out of it with the combination of flattery and financial incentive that men in his position defaulted to, and she listened politely and declined clearly, and thanked him for the years she had worked for Meridian, which had genuinely taught her a great deal. He tried once more, suggesting that the Bristol situation was a temporary setback and that there were other, more cooperative landowners with whom she could be successfully employed, and she told him with perfect composure that she did not believe her future lay with the railroad, and that was the end of it. She spent 2 weeks in Wichita settling her affairs. She had more savings than a person might expect, because she had been careful with money for years in the way of someone who grew up knowing that security was something you built yourself. She arranged the shipment of her few items of furniture, her books, her surveying equipment, her personal belongings. She wrote to Clayton every day, letters that began formally and became less formal with each one as she stopped self-editing, and his letters back were brief but precise in the way of a man who chose his words with care, and every one of them said something that she folded up and kept separate from the rest. She arrived back in Caldwell in the 3rd week of May, 1882, on a warm afternoon with the grassland all green and the sky enormous, and the smell of the air so different from the city that she took 3 slow, deep breaths before she did anything else. Clayton was waiting at the edge of town, which she had not expected. He had come in for supplies, or said he had, but he was standing at the edge of the main street holding his horse's reins and watching the road from the east with an expression that he did not trouble to conceal when he saw her. He walked out to meet her horse before she reached the town proper and said her name in the same way he had said it on the porch, just Rose, with nothing around it. "Hello, Clayton," she said, and smiled at him with the full force of the 2 weeks of wanting she had not been able to stop feeling since she rode away. He took her horse's reins in one hand and looked up at her and said, "Welcome back," and the 2 words carried more weight than a longer speech could have, because they were spoken by a man who meant exactly what he said and never said anything he did not mean. She settled in Caldwell with an efficiency that surprised the locals, though it perhaps should not have surprised anyone who understood the kind of woman Rose Hart was. She rented rooms from Mrs. Aldine at the hotel initially, and within a month had been consulted by 3 different parties on land boundary disputes that had been festering in the county for years, because the word got around quickly that there was a woman in Caldwell who could read a survey map and understood the law around it, and was not in the pocket of any of the major cattle interests. She and Clayton settled into a courtship that was, by the standards of 1882 in Kansas, both somewhat unconventional and entirely in keeping with who they both were. They were not the sort of people who performed courtship. They simply spent time together with growing frequency and deepening ease, and the people of Caldwell watched the development with the warm and slightly proprietary interest of a community that felt it had some stake in the outcome. He took her to visit Tom Garrett and his family, and she found herself welcomed there as fully as she had been at the gathering, and she and Martha Garrett struck up an immediate friendship based on a shared directness of temperament that neither of them bothered to soften for social purposes. Tom Garrett, who had clearly been given some account of Rose's role in raising the question of his tenancy with the railroad, shook her hand with a grip that conveyed more than words would have, and called her Miss Hart with a formality that was entirely respectful and nothing like dismissal. She met the Colton family too, young James Colton and his wife Clara and their infant son, who had been named William, and was a very serious-looking baby with strong opinions about the order of his day. Clara Colton was 23 years old and originally from Missouri, and had about her the particular resilience of a woman who had moved somewhere hard and decided to grow in it rather than be worn down by it, which was a quality Rose recognized and admired. One evening in June, 3 weeks after her return, she and Clayton sat on the porch of the limestone house as the sun went down, and she had been there often enough by now that the porch felt like somewhere she belonged rather than somewhere she was visiting. The rose bushes had flowered. There were deep red blooms along the front fence that she had stopped in front of when she rode in, and Clayton had come out and seen her stop there and had not said anything about it, just stood beside her in the evening light looking at the roses his grandmother had planted 30 years before. "My grandmother planted them the year she arrived," he had said. "She said she wanted something that would bloom every year and remind her that the hard years still produced beautiful things." "They do," Rose had said. Now on the porch he said, "I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking that I would like you to stay," he said. "Not in Caldwell, here. On this land." He was looking at the creek, and then he turned and looked at her directly. "I am asking if you would marry me, Rose. I am not asking you to stop being who you are or to give up any part of what you do. I am asking you to build something with me here, on this land, on this creek, in this house that my grandfather built, and that I have been taking care of with the hope, though I did not know it until recently, that someone would eventually be in it who deserved to be." Rose looked at him for a long moment. The evening sky over Kansas was a color that had no exact name, something between amber and pink and a deep blue that was just beginning at the horizon, and the first night birds were starting in the cottonwoods, and Sycamore Run caught the last light and sent it back in small silver flashes, and the rose bushes were still fragrant in the cooling air. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Clayton. There is nothing in the world I want more." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand as he had that afternoon on the back steps, with the same naturalness, and held it, and the evening settled around them with the completeness of something that has arrived exactly where it was meant to be. They were married in September of 1882, on the land itself, in front of the limestone house and the rose bushes, and the people of the county who had come to know them both through the spring and summer. The ceremony was performed by a circuit preacher named Hannigan, who was a small, energetic man with an enormous voice and genuine feeling for the occasion. Martha Garrett organized the reception with a thoroughness that Rose found both deeply touching and slightly overwhelming, and Tom Garrett made a speech that was incoherent in its structure, but completely sincere in its feeling, and received more applause than any organized speech could have. Webb the fiddle player was there, and he played the same reel he had played at the Garrett gathering in May, and Rose and Clayton danced it in the yard with the same ease as before, except that now there was nothing to separate toward or return to, which changed the character of the dancing completely, made it fuller and more open, a celebration of something already certain rather than a reaching toward something hoped for. Clara Colton cried, and then laughed at herself for crying, and her husband James put his arm around her, and their baby William regarded the dancing with his characteristic serious expression, and eventually fell asleep in his mother's arms with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has decided that the adults are a lost cause. In the receiving of toasts that followed the ceremony, someone, one of the older ranchers named Haskell, said loud enough to be heard across the yard that he had heard the Bristol land was all but sold to the railroad, but that clearly it had not been, and there was good-natured laughter, and Clayton said, in a voice pitched equally for Rose's ears and the general company, it was never for sale. But something came out of those negotiations that no amount of money could have bought. There was more laughter and considerable good-natured hollering, and Rose looked at her husband, with the feeling of a woman who has arrived somewhere she has been, without knowing it, traveling toward her whole life. The railroad, for what it was worth, did eventually shift its corridor by just over a mile to the east. Whether this was due to Rose's original recommendation, or to some subsequent engineering assessment, or to the practical mathematics of not wanting a public dispute with a well-regarded local family, depended on who you asked. Gerald Dunmore, if asked, would have said it was always the company's intention. The surveyors who actually moved the stakes would have said it was Rose Hart's detailed analysis that made the case. The result, in any case, was that the depot and maintenance yard went up on a stretch of open grazing land well clear of the Garrett and Colton properties, and both families remained where they were and continued to farm. The new Mrs. Bristol established herself as the most capable independent surveyor in the county within her first year of practice. She worked from an office in Caldwell, a small room above the general store that she fitted out with the precise practicality of a woman who knew what tools she needed and how to arrange them. And she was consulted not just by private landowners, but, increasingly, by the county itself on boundary and water rights matters. She was one of the first women in the region to be formally retained by a county government for professional services, which generated considerable discussion and some disapproval from certain quarters and complete indifference from Rose, who had been generating disapproval from certain quarters her entire professional life and had long since stopped factoring it into her planning. She and Clayton moved between her professional world and his agricultural one with a naturalness that was, for the time and place, remarkable. He came to understand the legal and surveying work in the same way he had understood her negotiating position from the first, with the clear-eyed directness of a man who respected competence wherever it lived. She came to understand the land, the actual ground-level understanding of soil and water and season and animal, in a way that her previous map-based knowledge had only gestured toward. She learned the names of things from him, the grasses and the birds and the insects, the way a particular quality of cloud on the western horizon meant weather within the day, the way the creek behaved in different seasons, and what each behavior told you about the watershed upstream. She planted her own rose bushes in the second spring of their marriage, along the east side of the house, where the afternoon sun was gentler, because she had learned from the Farmington's Almanac that roses preferred the morning light on their faces and the afternoon in more moderate doses. She chose two varieties, a deep red similar to Clayton's grandmother's bushes along the front fence, and a pale yellow one she had found at a nurseryman in Wichita on a professional trip, that had the most extraordinary fragrance of anything she had ever smelled, and that Clayton called, without apparent embarrassment, beautiful. Their first child was born in November of 1883. He arrived with considerable determination and at considerable speed, which the attending doctor, a small efficient woman named Dr. Evelyn Cole, who had come to Caldwell from Ohio the previous year, and was the first female physician in the county, said was entirely consistent with his parents. They named him Samuel Clayton Bristol, Samuel for Rose's father and Clayton for the only other name that seemed fully right. Samuel was, from the beginning, a child of the land and the creek and the limestone house, as if he had been grown from the same soil as the rose bushes. By the time he was a year old, he was pulling himself along the porch fence, and staring at the horses in the pasture with an expression of focused longing. By 2, he could identify 3 varieties of hawk by their flight pattern, which Clayton taught him with the same patient attention he brought to everything. And Rose documented in a small journal she had begun to keep for no professional purpose, but because she found, to her own surprised delight, that the particular facts of her son's development were among the most interesting things she had ever recorded. Life on the Bristol ranch settled into the rhythms of a full and productive existence. The Kansas winters were hard, and the springs were sometimes violent with storm. And in the summer of 1885, a drought took most of the hay crop and required a winter of careful management, and the kind of patient problem-solving that Clayton approached with the same steadiness he brought to everything difficult. Rose's income from the survey practice helped through the lean months, and she had always managed money with the exactness of someone who had learned early that savings are a form of freedom, and the Bristol household came through the drought intact and without debt. The Garrett family remained on the southeast corner through all of it, and Tom Garrett and Clayton worked together through the drought with a mutual dependability that was both practical and genuinely warm. Martha Garrett and Rose had by this point been close friends for 3 years, the kind of close friends who can sit together in silence without the silence being uncomfortable, which is the deepest kind of friendship Rose had ever had. She had not had many women friends before, not because she did not value female company, but because the work environment she had inhabited had been almost entirely male, and the female society available to her in Wichita had been organized around social coordinates that had little to do with her actual life. The friendships she formed in Caldwell with Martha Garrett and Clara Colton and Dr. Cole and 2 or 3 others were something new and genuine, and she valued them with a gratitude that she did not keep to herself. Their second child, a daughter, was born in March of 1886, and they named her Frances, for Clayton's mother. Frances arrived in the world with the force of an announcement, loudly and with complete conviction, and maintained both characteristics as she grew. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's auburn hair, and a personality that appeared to be entirely her own invention, which both of her parents regarded with a mixture of awe and the mild wariness appropriate to any force of nature. Samuel, at 2.5, received his sister with the generosity of a child who had always known the world was larger than himself, which Rose thought privately had something to do with being raised on a piece of land that dwarfed its human inhabitants on every side. He brought Frances small objects he considered interesting: a smooth creek stone, a hawk feather, a piece of particularly colorful mineral from the hillside, presenting them to her cradle with the solemnity of important gifts. Frances, for her part, grabbed everything he offered and attempted to eat it, which seemed to satisfy whatever exchange was being proposed. In the autumn of 1886, the Meridian Land and Railroad Company made one more approach to Clayton Bristol. This time they sent a very different representative, a senior partner from the company's Wichita office named Harlan, who arrived with a revised survey and a revised offer that was, he said, the most generous the company had ever made. He did not know, until he arrived at the Bristol ranch and found the wife already in the yard and already reading his body language, that he was about to negotiate with someone who had previously done his job and knew exactly how it was done. Rose did not handle the conversation aggressively. She handled it the way she handled everything, clearly and directly and with complete preparation. She told Harlan, politely and with full supporting documentation that she produced from her office in Caldwell the next morning, that the alternate eastern corridor was not only viable but was already partially surveyed, and that she had taken the liberty of preparing a professional survey document supporting that route over the past year, initially for her own professional satisfaction, and now because it seemed timely. She offered to discuss the documentation with the company's engineers. She suggested that the question of the Bristol land, was not worth the continued expenditure of the company's time and resources given the genuine alternative. Harlan listened with the expression of a man who is being outmaneuvered and knows it, and is struggling to find the professional posture that allows him to retreat with dignity. Rose provided him that posture by saying that the documentation was freely available to the company, and that she sought no compensation for it, which was both true and the kind of generosity that made it very difficult to refuse gracefully. The railroad took the alternate route. Not immediately and not without internal discussion, but by the spring of 1887, the stakes were in the ground on the eastern corridor, and the Bristol land stayed whole, and the Bristol family stayed on it. Clayton, when she told him the news, looked at her across the kitchen table where she had spread the final survey confirmation, and his expression was the one she had learned to love best, the one that was not the almost smile or the direct gaze alone but both together, the expression he had when the world had exceeded his reasonable expectations. "You did that," he said. "I did the survey," she said. "You did the 40 years of building something worth protecting." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Equal parts," he said. "Equal parts," she agreed. Samuel started school in Caldwell in 1887, riding in on a small chestnut mare that Clayton had spent 3 months gentle breaking for exactly this purpose, so that the horse would be reliably steady on the road and in town. He was, his teacher informed Rose at the first parent meeting, unusually good at mathematics and geography, and had a habit of correcting the maps in the schoolhouse textbooks, which the teacher found alternately charming and challenging depending on the day. Rose presented the school with 2 new survey maps of Kansas and Indian Territory, with the accuracy and completeness that the school's existing materials lacked, and the teacher found this both enormously helpful and slightly humbling. The world around Caldwell changed through the late 80s with the gathered momentum of the frontier's closing. New families came, new business, more organized law and civic structure. The range wars that had plagued the cattle country to the west sent occasional reverberations through Seward County, and there were years when the competition over water rights in the region grew sharp enough to require the kind of legal and survey documentation that kept Rose's practice consistently busy. She handled several cases that had implications for neighboring communities, always with the same thoroughness, and her reputation extended well beyond Caldwell, so that by 1889 she was receiving consultations from as far as Dodge City. She made these trips with the straightforward practicality she brought to everything professional, and she and Clayton had worked out an arrangement early in their marriage that both of them found entirely reasonable, which was that, when she traveled, he managed the household with the complete competence of a man who had been taking care of himself and a significant piece of land for a long time before she arrived, and when he needed to be away from the ranch for ranch-related reasons, she adjusted her schedule accordingly. And neither of them thought there was anything remarkable about this. The people who did find it remarkable were free to find it so without any interference from the Bristols. Frances, at 3, was a force of considerable dimension. She had, from the moment she could walk, an absolute conviction in her right to be present in any activity that was happening on the property, whether that was her father mending fence or her mother doing survey calculations at the kitchen table or Samuel and the Garrett children playing in the creek. She inserted herself into these activities without apology and with a determination to contribute that was, if you were paying attention, often genuinely useful. Clayton said she was exactly like her mother, and Rose said she was exactly like herself, and they were both right. In the spring of 1890, Martha Garrett told Rose that she was expecting her 3rd child, a fact she delivered over the kitchen table at the Bristol house with a mixture of joy and pragmatic assessment of the logistical challenges involved, and Rose said that she too was expecting, which she had not yet told Clayton, and Martha looked at her and said, "When are you going to tell him?" And Rose said, "Tonight," and Martha said, "Good, because I have been watching you not tell him for a week, and it has been driving me absolutely to distraction." She told him that evening on the porch, because the porch was where the important things happened between them, had been since the beginning. She said simply, "We are expecting again," and he was quiet for a moment and then turned to her with an expression of such pure and uncomplicated happiness that it made her eyes fill. And she did not cry often, had never cried easily, but the happiness of this man was one of the few things in her life that reached below her considerable self-possession and touched something that was not composed and not controlled and not in any way managed. "Are you happy?" He asked because he always asked, always wanted to know the actual answer rather than the assumed one. "I am the happiest I have ever been in my life," she said, "in a way that I did not know was available to me before I came here." He moved his chair closer to hers, as he had done on summer evenings for 8 years by now, until their chairs were side by side, and their hands were together on the armrest between them, and the evening settled over Sycamore Run with the gold and blue of a Kansas spring dusk, and the rose bushes sent their fragrance across the porch, and from the direction of the Garrett farm, a half-mile east, came the faint sound of Tom Garrett's voice calling his children in for supper. Their third child, another son, was born in November of 1890, and they named him Thomas James Bristol. Thomas for Tom Garrett, who had wept without restraint when they told him and been not at all embarrassed about it, and James for James Colton, who had remained their neighbor and friend through 8 years of shared fence lines and shared harvests and shared difficulty. Thomas arrived in the world with his father's steadiness and his mother's eyes, which were hazel and direct, and he was a quiet baby and a contemplative child, which made Frances, at 4, periodically suspicious of him. Samuel, at 7, received him with the same generosity with which he had received his sister, and began calling him Tom almost immediately, which the boy seemed to accept as entirely correct. The Bristol land, in the decade that followed, became one of the most productive and stable operations in the county. Not the largest, and not the most commercially ambitious, but reliably well-managed and consistently prosperous in the way of land that has been worked by people who understand it well and intend to remain. Rose's survey practice grew to the point that she employed an assistant, a young man from Lawrence named Peter, who was quiet and meticulous, and who learned quickly that Hart Bristol's professional standards were not a moving target. Clayton expanded the breeding operation, focusing on the good working horses that were consistently in demand across the cattle country, and developed a reputation for animals that were well-tempered and sound, which was the kind of reputation that built slowly and held permanently. Sycamore Run continued to run clear over smooth limestone through every season. The rose bushes bloomed every June without fail, the deep red ones along the front fence and the pale yellow ones along the east side of the house, and the smell of them on a warm evening was something that each of the Bristol children would carry in their memories their whole lives as the olfactory signature of home. On an evening in the early summer of 1892, exactly 10 years since a woman on a business trip had ridden into Caldwell with a leather satchel full of survey documents and an employer's instructions to buy a piece of land that was not for sale, Rose and Clayton sat on the porch of the limestone house in the particular comfortable silence that has no awkwardness in it and never has, the silence of two people entirely at ease with each other and with the world they have built together. Samuel was inside reading. He was 9 now and deeply serious about it. Frances was in the yard attempting to teach Tom, who was 18 months old, to identify the different hawk species by their silhouettes, an educational ambition she had apparently inherited from her father and prosecuted with her own inimitable force. Tom was looking at the sky with the thoughtful expression that appeared to be his default response to everything. "Are you thinking about something?" Clayton asked, which was a question he asked regularly, because he had never made the assumption that silence was contentment. "I am thinking about 10 years ago," she said, "about riding into Caldwell with a satchel full of arguments for why you should sell me your land." "You were very persuasive," he said, with the full smile, the real one that she had loved for a decade. "I was completely unsuccessful," she pointed out. "In the stated objective," he agreed. "In every other way, I would say the negotiation concluded favorably." She looked at him. She looked at the limestone house glowing in the evening light. She looked at Francis in the yard and Tom looking at the sky, and thought about Samuel inside with his book, and the yellow rose bushes sending their fragrance across the porch, and the creek running clear 30 yards away, and the horses in the south pasture, and the kitchen garden that she had learned to tend with the same precision she brought to survey work, and the neighbors who were also friends, and the life that had grown from a single week in May of 1882, when she had been sent to buy something that turned out to be, in every possible sense, not for sale. What had come back with her, she thought, was not negotiable, had never been negotiable, had been from the beginning exactly what it was, something that existed outside the categories of purchase and sale, something that could not be measured in acreage or dollars or terms of transition. It was the particular and irreplaceable fact of this man and this land and this life and these children and this creek, and the way the evening light came across the Kansas grassland and turned everything it touched to gold. "Favorably," she said. "Yes, I think that is the word." He reached across and took her hand, which was the same gesture as the first time, with all the 10 years of their life together now in it like rings in a tree. The creek ran. The light went on changing. Tom Garrett called from the neighboring farm, his voice carrying in the still evening air the way voices do in flat country, and Clayton answered, and Francis looked up at the sound, and the baby pointed at a hawk crossing the last blue of the sky above the cottonwoods with one certain finger, and Rose held her husband's hand and was entirely, completely, and permanently home. There was nothing left to negotiate, and there never had been. Some things come into being complete and certain, and beyond the reach of any contract or deed or letter of offer, and you can only receive them with the honesty they deserve and build your whole life in the warmth of them. Rose Hart, who had ridden into Caldwell, Kansas, on a business trip in the spring of 1882 and had come back with something that could not be negotiated back, knew this as completely and as permanently as she had ever known anything. The rose bushes bloomed, the creek ran, the children grew, the land held them all. And on the limestone house that his grandfather had built with his own hands from the Kansas earth, the evening light rested like a benediction, and the door that opened onto the porch fit perfectly in its frame, and inside and outside, and the particular piece of ground between the creek and the cottonwoods, the world was whole.